Okay, so here we are. Another Thursday evening and more stories from 221B Baker Street. I only have 3 more stories left of this book. And then I'm thinking about other books to go into. I may go check up some of Sherlock Holmes' contemporaries. Thank you, Oni. And congrats on first. Ugh. And a stretch. And a hydrate. Okay. It may or may not be hydrating with coffee, but it's a hydration coffee, to be honest. Yes, we are doing more Sherlock Holmes. And I do only have 3 more stories in this book. I may go to one of my other sets, which is a couple of books called The Rivals of Sherlock Holmes, which were other detective stories written about the same time period. So I may do that. I haven't quite made up my mind yet. I was also thinking about getting into Wonderland books, but those are definitely opium driven, so it would go well with Sherlock Holmes. But I hope we've all had a fairly good week. None of my sound alerts are working again, or still, as it may be. I was testing them all during the opening, and not a single one worked. Which is strange, because I haven't changed any of the settings since I originally set them up, and they were working then. But, again, I don't know how to fix it. I've even followed their instructions on how to fix it, and it didn't work. I did a complete reset of all the systems for each one of them, and nothing. So I don't know what's going on. So I really don't know what's going on with my audio settings. Though, I need to just reset all of those anyway. I tried putting them into a bundle so that I'll be in the same spot, and I could just copy the bundle over to different scenes, and I wouldn't have to worry about doing it as much. But it hasn't worked, so... That's strange, I haven't advertised my book on a stream for a while. I leave all the advertising up to Kel. I did apparently get another one sold in the past month or so, because they decided they were going to pay me at the end of this month. Or tomorrow, I think. So it'll be nice to get another couple of bucks. I really need to get back to editing the second set and get back to doing my autobiography, sorta. I guess I could just come to a stopping point on that and do it in multiple books too. I don't know. Honestly, I could do that in a bunch of short stories, but I'd have to get the art permissions, and I haven't gotten that yet. And I've also been trying to do my own illustrations, and honestly, I'm not that great at drawing. I posted them on Twitter, and I posted them on Dusk server under the art, and my version of Little Red Riding Hood kind of looks like a guy in drag because of the way I was doing the sketching. And a lot of them, if I didn't include the title, I don't think people would know what story it was for. So even though I did one sketch per story, but I'm sketching with a fountain pen, so I'm doing good, I guess. I don't know. Yes, Sherlock Holmes. And the last book by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. And there's a Chansey in chat. So let me go ahead and get over to the study. Alright. Wait for the room to finish popping up. Okay, there's the chat window. I wish my alerts would work though. But yeah. See, last week I only got one Sherlock Holmes story read, and that was, I believe, The Adventure of the Dying Detective. Make sure, yeah, it was The Adventure of the Dying Detective last week. And it was 19 pages, but it still took me most of the time to do it. I've only got 3 stories left in this book. The first one being The Disappearance of Lady Frances Carfax. If anyone knows the name Carfax, it's one tied to Dracula, because it was done at Carfax Abbey. Then I've got The Adventure of the Devil's Foot. And then finally, His Last Bow. And then that will be the end of this book. The Disappearance of Lady Frances Carfax is 22 pages, so it might take the evening. And The Adventure of the Devil's Foot is 28. So it may be another week, and then finally His Last Bow, which, well enough, I don't think is that long. Let's see, Last Bow starts on page. It starts at 195 and goes to 212. Yeah, that's going to be another one. So I've got 3 weeks of stories, including this one. And if anyone hasn't gone to the YouTube playlist that has all of these stories on it, you can listen to all of them if you'd really like to. I will post a link here in a second, as soon as I get it pulled up myself. Okay. Options, shareable link. So all the Sherlock Holmes stories I've read so far are here on YouTube, including some that I had interruptions on for the stream, which hopefully I won't have anymore because I've got 2 different wireless connectors hooking it up to my internet. If one of them goes out, the other should still be going to. So, but the ones I had to edit some. I'm not great at editing, but luckily it wasn't that a difficult one. Because I literally said the wrong title of the story after restarting myself from reading it the first time last week. And another one, I was having to cut out the blank part where the screen ended, and I just decided I would go ahead and use my OBS recording instead. I've been having some problems with my video completely freezing up. And the stream, well, YouTube Studio will freeze, and I'll be less animated than I usually am, just because it doesn't track my mouth as well as it really could or should. So my Live 2D just was frozen for the last 5 minutes of the story. But hopefully it won't happen again tonight. As far as I can tell, technically everything on my computer is running smoothly. One can only hope and pray, I suppose. Let me make sure something's turned off. Don't want any alerts on my phone. That also happens. Okay. So hopefully I won't have any interruptions. And I'm sorry that I won't have any sound alerts popping up because... wow, sound alerts doesn't work. Hey, Guilty. Welcome in. I haven't gotten into the story yet. Honestly, I haven't picked up the book yet. Sound alerts aren't on again because they weren't working when I was doing the pre-stream stuff. I can't seem to figure out why they aren't working. So, for the time being, I have to leave them off. But we are at 9:11, so it's a minute past when I should have been starting already. Yeah. Okay. So, our story for this week: The Disappearance of Lady Frances Carfax. "But why Turkish?" asked Mr. Sherlock Holmes, fixed gazingly at my boots. I was reclining in the cane-backed chair of the moment, and my feet protruded, had attracted his ever-active attention. "English," I answered, in some surprise. "I got them at Latimer's in Oxford Street." Holmes smiled with an expression of weary patience. "The bath," he said. "The bath. Why the relaxing and expensive Turkish rather than the invigorating homemade article?" "Because for the last few days I've been feeling rheumatic and old. A Turkish bath is what we call an alternative in medicine, a fresh starting point, a cleanser to the system. By the way, Holmes," I added, "I have no doubt the connection between my boots and a Turkish bath is perfectly a self-evident one to a logical mind, and yet I should be obliged to you if you would indicate it." "The training of reason is not very obscure, Watson," said Holmes with a mischievous twinkle. "It belongs to the same elementary class of deduction which I should illustrate if I were to ask you who shared your cab in your drive this morning." "I don't admit that the fresh illustration is an explanation," said I, with some asperity. Bravo, Watson. A dignified and logical remonstrance. Let me see, what are the points? Take the last one first, the cab. You observe that you have some splashes on the left sleeve of your shoulder of your coat. Had you sat in the center of the hansom, you would have probably had no splashes, and if you had been certainly been symmetrical. Therefore, it is clear that you sat at the side. Therefore, it is equally clear that you had a companion.
That is very evident.
Absurdly commonplace, is it not?
But the boots and the bath.
Equally childish. You're in the habit of doing up your boots in a certain way. I see them on the occasion fastened with an elaborate double bow, which is not your usual method of tying them. You have, therefore, had them off. Who has tied them? A bootmaker, or a boy at the bath. It is unlikely that it is a bootmaker, since your boots are nearly new. Well, what remains? A bath. Absurd, is it not? But for all that, the Turkish bath has served a purpose.
What is that?
You say that you have had it because you needed a change. Let me suggest that you take one. How would lasagna do today, my dear Watson? First-class tickets and all expenses paid on a princely scale.
Splendid, but why? Holmes leaned back in his armchair and took his notebook from one's pocket.
One of the most dangerous cases in the world, said he, is the drifting and friendless woman. She is the most harmless and often the most useful of mortals, but she is inevitable, inciter of crime in others. She is helpless, she is migratory, she has sufficient means to take her from country to country and from hotel to hotel. She is not lost, as often as not, in a maze of obscure pensions and boarding houses. She is a stray chicken in a world of foxes. When she is gobbled up, she is hardly missed. I much fear that some evil has come to the Lady Frances Carfax.
I was relieved at the sudden descent from the general to the particular. Holmes consulted his notes.
Lady Frances, he continued, is the sole survivor of the direct family of the late Earl of Ruffton. The estates went, as you may remember, in the male line. She was left with limited means, with some remarkable old Spanish jewelry of silver and curiously cut diamonds, to which she was fondly attached, for she refused to leave them with her banker and always carried them about with her. The rather poetic figure, this Lady Frances, a beautiful woman, still in fresh middle age, and yet, by a strange chance, the last derelict of only 20 years ago of a godly fleet.
What has happened to her, then?
Ah, what has happened to the Lady Frances? Is she alive or dead? There is our problem. She is a lady of precise habits, and for 4 years it has been her invariable custom to write every second week to Miss Daubney, her old governess, who is long retired and lives in Camberwell. It is this Miss Daubney who consulted me. Nearly 5 weeks have passed without a word. The last letter was from a Hotel National in Lausanne. Lady Frances seems to have left there and given no address. The family are anxious, and they are exceedingly wealthy. No sum will be spared if we can clear the matter up.
Is Miss Daubney the only source of information? Surely they had other correspondents.
There is one correspondent who is a sure draw, Watson. That is the bank. Single ladies must live, and their passbooks are compressed diaries. She banks at Sylvester's. I had glanced over her account. The last check but one paid her bill at Lausanne, and it was a large one and probably left her with cash in hand. Only one check has been drawn since.
To whom and where?
To Miss Marie Devine. There is nothing to show where the check was drawn. It was cashed to Credit Lyonnais at Montpellier less than 3 weeks ago. The sum was £50.
And who is Miss Marie Devine?
That also I have been able to discover. Miss Marie Devine was the lady of Sir Francis Carfax. She should have paid her in check, we have not yet determined. I have no doubt, however, that your researches will soon clear the matter up.
What? My researches?
Hence the health-giving expedition to Lausanne. You know that I cannot possibly leave London while old Abrahams is in the mortal terror for his life. Besides, on general principles, it is best that I should not leave the country. Scotland Yard feels lonely without me, and it causes an unhealthy excitement among the criminal classes. Go then, my dear Watson, and if my humble counsel can ever be of value at so extravagant a rate as 2 pence a word, it waits your disposal night and day at the end of the continental wire.
2 days later found me at the National Hotel at Zwan, where I received every courtesy at the hands of M. Mosier, the well-known manager. Lady Frances, as he informed me, had stayed there for several weeks. She had been much liked by all who met her. Her age was not more than 40. She was still handsome, and bore every sign of having in her youth been a very lovely woman. M. Mosier knew nothing of valuable jewelry, but it had been marked by the servants that the heavy trunk in the lady's bedroom was always scrupulously locked. Marie Devine, the maid, was as popular as her mistress. She was actually engaged to one of the head waiters in the hotel, and there was no difficulty in getting her address. It was 11, Rue de Trahan, Montpellier. All of this I jotted down, and felt that Holmes himself could not have been more adroit in collecting his facts. Only one corner still remained in the shadow. No light which I possessed could clear up the cause of the lady's sudden departure. She was very happy in Lausanne. There was every reason to believe that she intended to remain for the season in her luxurious rooms overlooking the lake. And yet she had left at a single day's notice, which involved her in useless payment of a week's rent. Only Jules Vibert, the lover of the maid, had any suggestion to offer. He connected the sudden departure with a visit to the hotel a day or two before of a tall, dark-bearded man. "Un sauvage, un véritable sauvage!" cried Jules Vivant. The man had rooms somewhere in town. He had been talking earnestly to Madame on the promenade of the lake. Then he had called. She had refused to see him. He was English, but his name was there was no record. The madam had left the place immediately afterwards. Jules Vibert, and what was of more importance, Jules Vibert's sweetheart, thought on this call and this departure were cause and effect. Only one thing Jules could not discuss. That was the reason why Marie had left her mistress. Of that he could say or would say nothing. If I wished to know, I must go to Montpellier to ask her. So ended the first chapter of my inquiry. The second was devoted to the place at which Lady Frances Carfax had sought when she left Lausanne. Concerning this there had been some secrecy, which confirmed the idea that she had gone with the intention of throwing someone off her track. Otherwise, why should she leave her luggage have been opened in Baden? Both she and it reached Rennes from circuitous route. Thus much I gathered from the manager of Cook's local office. So to Baden I went, after dispatching to Holmes an account of all my proceedings, and receiving in reply a telegram of half-humorous commendation. At Baden the track had not been difficult to follow. Lady Frances had stayed with an English officer for a fortnight. Whilst there she had made the acquaintance of Dr. Schlesinger and his wife, a missionary from South America. Like most lonely ladies, Lady Frances found her comfort in occupation and religion. Dr. Schlesinger's remarkable personality, his whole-hearted devotion, and the fact that he was recovering from a disease contracted in his exercise of his apostolic duties affected her deeply. She had helped Mrs. Schlesinger in the nursing and convalescent saint. He spent his day, as the manager described to me, upon a lounge chair on the veranda, with a lady attendant upon either side of him. He was prepared to map of the Holy Land, and a special reference to the kingdom of Madiantes, upon which he was writing a monograph. Finally, having improved much in health, he and his wife returned to London, and Lady Frances had started thither in their company. This was just 3 weeks before, and the manager had heard nothing since. As to the maid, Marie, she had gone off some days before in a flood of tears, after informing the other maids that she was leaving the service forever. Dr. Schlesinger had paid the bill of the whole party before his departure. "By the way," said the landlord in conclusion, "you are not the only friend of Lady Frances Carfax who is inquiring after her just now. Only a week ago or so we had a man here upon the same errand." "Did he give a name?" asked I. "None, but he was an Englishman, though of an unusual type." "A savage?" said I, linking the facts of my fashion with my illustrious friend. Exactly, that describes him very well. He is a bulky, bearded, sunburned fellow, who looks as if he were more at home in a farmer's inn than in a fashionable hotel. A hard, fierce man, I should think, and one whom I should worry to offend. Already the mystery began to define itself, as figures grew clear with lifting fog. Here was this good and pious lady pursued from place to place by a sinister and unrelenting figure. She feared him, or she would not have fled from Lausanne. He had still followed. Sooner or later he would overtake her. Had he already overtaken her? Was that the secret of her continued silence? Could the good people who were her companions not screen her from this violence or his blackmail? What horrible purpose, what deep design lay behind his long pursuit? There was a problem which I had to solve. To Holmes I wrote showing how rapidly and surely I had got down to the roots of the matter. In reply I had a telegram asking for a description of Dr. Shogersen's left ear. Holmes's idea of humor is strange and occasionally offensive, so I took no notice of his ill-timed jest. Indeed, I had already reached Montpellier in my pursuit of the maid, Marie, before his message had come. I had no difficulty in finding the ex-servant and in learning all that she could tell me. She was a devoted creature who had only left her mistress because she was sure that she was in good hands and because her own approaching marriage had made a separation inevitable in any case. Her mistress had, as she confessed with distress, shown some irritability of temper towards her during the stay in Baden, and had even questioned her once if she had suspicions of her honesty, and this had made the parting easier than it would otherwise have been. Lady Frances had given her £50 as a wedding present. Like me, Marie viewed a deep distrust with the stranger who had driven her mistress from Lausanne. With her own eyes she had seen him seize the lady's wrist with great violence on the public promenade by the lake. He was a fierce and terrible man. She believed that it could be out of dread of him that Lady Frances had accepted the escort of the Schlesingers to London. She had never spoken to Marie about it, but many little signs had convinced the maid that her mistress lived in a state of continual nervous apprehension. So far she had gotten her narrative, when suddenly she sprang from her chair, and her face was convulsed with surprise and fear. "See," she cried, "the miscreant follows still. There is a very strange man whom I speak." Through an open sitting window I saw a huge, swarthy man with a bristling black beard walking slowly down the center of the street and staring eagerly at the numbers of the houses. It was clear, like myself, he was on the track of the maid. Acting upon the impulse of the moment, I rushed out and accosted him. "You are an Englishman," I said. "What if I am?" he asked, in the most villainous scowl. "May I ask what your name is?" "No, you may not," he said, with derision. The situation was awkward, but the most direct way is often the best. "Where is the Lady Frances Carfax?" I asked. He stared at me with amazement. "What have you done with her? What have you pursued her for? I insist upon an answer," said I. The fellow gave a bellow of anger and sprang upon me like a tiger. I have held my own in many a struggle, but the man had a grip of iron and a fury of a fiend. His hand was on my throat, and my senses were nearly gone before this unshaven French ouvroir in a blue blouse started out from the cabaret opposite, with a cudgel in his hand, and struck my assailant with a sharp crack over the forearm, which made him leave go his hold. He stood for an instant fuming with rage and uncertain whether he should not renew his attack. Then, with a snarl of anger, he left me and entered the cottage from which I had just come. I turned to thank my preserver, who stood beside me on the roadway. "Well, Watson," said he, "a very pretty hash you have laid of it. I rather think you had come back with me to London by the midnight express." An hour afterwards, Sherlock Holmes, in his usual garment and style, was seated in my private room at the hotel. His explanation of his sudden and opportune appearance was simplicity itself, for, finding that he could get away from London, he determined to head me off at the next obvious point of my travels. In the disguise of a working man, he had sat in the cabaret, waiting for my appearance. "And a singularly consistent investigation you have made, my dear Watson," said he.
I cannot at the moment recall any possible blunder which you have omitted. The total effect of your proceedings has been given the alarm everywhere, to discover nothing.
Perhaps you would have done no better, I answered bitterly.
There's no perhaps about it. I have done better. Here is the Honorable Philip Green, who is a fellow lodger with you in this hotel, and we may find him at the starting point for a more successful investigation.
A card had come up on the salver, and it followed by the same bearded ruffian who attacked me in the street. He started when he saw me. "What is this, Holmes?" he asked. "I heard your note and I have come, but what does this man do with the matter?"
This is my old friend and associate, Dr. Watson, who is helping us in this affair.
The stranger held out a huge sun-bearded hand with a few words of apology. "I hope I didn't harm you. When you accused me of hurting her, I lost my grip of myself. Indeed, I'm not responsible in these days. My nerves are like live wires, but this situation is beyond me. What I want to know is, in the first place, Mr. Holmes, is how in the world you came to hear of my existence at all."
I am in touch with Miss Daubney, Lady Francis's governess.
"Oh, it's Susan Dobsey with the mob cap? I remember her well."
"And she remembers you. It was in the days before you found out better to go to South Africa."
"Aye, I see you know my whole story. I need hide nothing from you. I swear, Mr. Holmes, that there was never in this world a man who loved a woman with more wholehearted love than I had for Frances. I was a wild youngster, I know, not worse than the others in my class, but her mind was pure as snow. She could not bear the shadow of coarseness, so when she came to hear things I had done, she would have no more to say to me. And yet she loved me. That is the wonder of it. Loved me well enough to remain single all her saintly days just for my sake alone. When the years had passed and I had made the money at Babberton, I thought I perhaps could seek her out and soften her. I heard that she was still unmarried. I found her at Lausanne and tried all on you. She weakened, I think, but her will was strong, and when I called next she had left town. I traced her to Baden, and then after a time heard her maid was there. I'm a rough fellow, fresh from a rough life, and when Dr. Watson spoke to me as he did, I lost hold of myself for a moment. For God's sake, tell me what has become of Lady Frances."
"That is for us to find out,"
said Sherlock Holmes with particular gravity.
"What is your London address, Mr. Green?"
"The Languin Hotel will find me."
"Then may I recommend that you return there and be on hand in case I should want you. I have no desire to encourage false hopes, but you may rest assured that all that can be done will be done for the safety of Lady Frances. I can say no more for the instant. I will leave you this card so that you may be able to keep in touch with us. Now, Watson, if you will pack your bag, I will cable Mrs. Hudson to make one of her best efforts for 2 hungry travelers at 7:30 tomorrow."
A telegram was waiting for us when we reached our Baker Street rooms, which Holmes read with an exclamation of interest and threw across the room to me. "Jagged or torn" was the message, and the place was Baden. "What is this?" I asked.
"It is everything," Holmes answered. "You may remember that my seemingly irrelevant question as to the clerical gentleman's left ear. You did not answer it."
"I left Baden and could not inquire."
"Exactly. For this reason I sent a duplicate to the manager of the English Le Havre, whose answer lies here."
"What does it show?"
"It shows, my dear Watson, that we are dealing with an exceptionally astute and dangerous man. The Reverend Dr. Singular, missionary from South America, is none other than the Holy Peters, one of the most unscrupulous rascals that Australia has ever evolved. And for a young country it has turned out some very finished types. His particular speciality is the beguiling of lonely women who playing upon their religious feelings, and his so-called wife, an Englishwoman named Fraser, is worthy helpmate. The nature of his tactics suggests his identity to me, and his particular physicality — he was bitten badly in a saloon fight in Adelaide in '89 — confirmed my suspicion. This poor lady is in the hands of a most infernal company, who will stick at nothing, Watson. That she is already dead is a very likely supposition. If not, she is undoubtedly in some sort of confinement and unable to write Miss Daubney or her other friends. It is always possible that she never reached London, or that she has passed through it, but the former is improbable, as, with her suspicion of registration, it is not easy for foreigners to play tricks on the continental police, and the latter is also unlikely, as these rogues could not hope to find any other place where it would be easy to keep a person under restraint. All my instincts tell me that she is in London, but as we have at present no possible means of telling where, we can only take the obvious steps, eat our dinner, and possess our souls in patience. Later in the evening, I will stroll down and have a word with Lestrade at Scotland Yard.
But neither the official police nor Holmes's own small, very efficient organization sufficed to clear away any mystery. Amid the crowded millions of London, the three persons we sought were as completely obliterated as if they never lived. Advertisements were tried and failed. Clues were followed and led to nothing. Every criminal resort which Schlesinger might frequent was drawn in vain. His old associates were watched, but they kept clear of him. And then suddenly, after a week of helpless suspense, there came a flash of light. A silver and brilliant pendant of old Spanish design had been pawned at Brevington's on Westminster Road. The pawner was a large, clean-shaven man of clerical appearance. His name and address were demonstratively false. The ear had escaped notice, but the description was surely that of Schlesinger. 3 times had our bearded friend called Langham from the news, 3rd time within an hour of the fresh developments. His clothes were getting looser on his great body. He seemed to be wilting away in his anxiety. "If you will only give me something to do," was his constant wail. At last Holmes could oblige him.
He has begun to pawn the jewels. We should get him now.
But what does this mean? Any harm has befallen to Lady Frances? Holmes shook his head gravely.
Supposing that they have held her prisoner up until now, it is clear that they cannot let her loose without their own destruction. We must prepare for the worst.
What can I do?
These people do not know you by sight.
No.
It is possible that he will go to some other pawnbroker in the future. In that case, we must begin again. On the other hand, he has a fair price and no questions asked. So if he is in need of ready money, he will probably come back to Bevington's. I will give you a note to them, and they will let you wait in the shop. If the fellow comes, you will follow him home. No indiscretion, and above all, no violence. I put you in your honor that you will take no step without my knowledge and consent.
For 2 days, the Honourable Philip Green, he was, I may mention, the son of a famous admiral of that name who commanded the Sea of Azov fleet in the Crimean War. Brought us no news. On the evening of the 3rd, he rushed into our sitting-room, pale, trembling, and with every muscle of his powerful frame quivering with excitement. "We have him!" he cried. He was incoherent in his agitation. Holmes soothed him with a few words and thrust him into an armchair.
Come now, give us the order of events, said he.
"She came only an hour ago. It was his wife this time, but the pendant she brought was the fellow of the other. She was this tall, pale woman with ferret eyes."
"That is the lady," said Holmes.
She left the office and I followed her. She walked up Kensington Road, and I kept behind her. Presently she went into a shop, Mr. Holmes. It was an undertaker's. My companion started.
"Well,"
he asked, in a vibrant voice which showed the fiery soul behind the very cold grey face. She was talking to the woman behind the counter. I heard it as well. "It is late," I heard her say, and their words to that effect. The woman was excusing herself. "I should be there before now," she answered. "It took longer being out of the ordinary." They both stopped and looked at me, so I asked some question and then left the shop.
"You did excellently well. What happened next?"
The woman came out, and I hid myself in the doorway. Her suspicions had been aroused, I think, for she looked around her. Then she called a cab and got in. I was lucky enough to get another and so to follow her. She shot down past the number 36 Poultry Square, Brixton. I drove past, left my cab on the corner of the square, and watched the house.
Did you see anyone?
The windows were all in darkness save for one on the lower floor. The blind was down and I could not see in. I was standing there wondering what I should do next when a covered van drove up with 2 men in it. They descended, took something out of the van, and carried it up the steps to the hall door. Mr. Holmes, it was a coffin.
Ah!
For an instant I was on the point of rushing in. The door would have been open to admit the men and their burden. It was a woman who had opened it, but as soon as I stood there I caught a glimpse of me, and I think she recognized me. I saw her for a start, and she hastily closed the door. I remembered my promise to you, and here I am.
You have done excellent work, said Holmes, scribbling down a few words upon a half-sheet of paper. We can do nothing of legal without a warrant, and you should serve the cause by taking down this note to the authorities and getting one. There may be some difficulty, but I should think that the sale of the jewelry should be sufficient. Lestrade will see to all the details.
But they may murder her in the meantime. What would the coffin mean, and for whom would it be for her?
We will do all that we can be done, Miss Green. Not a moment will be lost. Leave it in our hands now, Watson. He added as our client hurried away. He will see the regular forces on move. We are, as usual, the irregulars, and we must take our own line of action. The situation strikes me as so desperate that the most extreme measures are justified. Not a moment is to be lost, getting to Portman Square. Let us try to reconstruct the situation, he said as we drove swiftly past the Houses of Parliament and over Westminster Bridge. These villains have coaxed this unhappy lady to London, after first alienating her from her faithful maid. If she has written any letters, they have been intercepted. Though through some confederates, they have engaged a furnished house. Once inside it, they have made her a prisoner, and they will have become possessed of the valuable jewelry which has been the object of their thirst. Already have they begun to sell part of it, which seems safe enough to them, since they have no reason to think that anyone is interested in the lady's fate. When she is released, she will, of course, denounce them. Therefore, she must not be released. But they cannot keep her under lock and key forever, so murder is their only solution.
That seems very clear.
Now we will take another line of reasoning. When you follow 2 separate chains of thought, Watson, you will find some point of intersection which should approximate the truth. We will start now, not from the lady, but from the coffin, and argue backwards. That incident proves, I fear, beyond all doubt, that the lady is dead. It points also to an unorthodox method of proper accompaniment of medical certification and official sanction. Had the lady been obviously murdered, they would have buried her in the hole in the back garden. But here, all in the open and regular. What does it mean? Surely that they have done her to death in some way that has deceived the doctor, or simulated a natural end. Poisoning, perhaps. And yet, how strange that they should ever let a doctor approach her unless he were an confederate, which is hardly a credible position.
Could they have forged a medical certificate?
Dangerous, Watson, very dangerous. No, I hardly see them doing that. Pull up, cabby. This is evidently the undertaker's, for we have just passed the pawnbrokers. Would you go in, Watson? Your appearance inspires confidence. Ask what hour the Putney Square funeral takes place tomorrow.
The woman in the shop answered me without hesitation that it was to be 8 o'clock in the morning.
You see, Watson, no mystery, everything above board. In some way the legal forms have undoubtedly been complied with, and they think that they have little to fear. Well, there's nothing to do for it now except a direct frontal attack. Are you armed?
My stick?
Well, we shall be strong enough. Thrice is he armed who hath his quarrel just.
We simply couldn't afford to wait for the police, or to keep within a few corners of the law.
You can drive off, cabby. Now, Watson, we'll just take our luck together, and we have occasionally done in the past.
It rung loudly at the door of the great dark house in the center of Pulteney Square. It was opened immediately, and the tall figure of a woman was outlined against the dim light hall.
"Well, what do you want?"
she asked sharply, peering at us through the darkness.
"I want to speak to Dr. Schlesinger," said Holmes.
There's no such person here, she answered, and tried to close the door, but Holmes had jammed it with his foot. Well, I want to see the man who lives here, whatever he may call himself, said Holmes firmly. She hesitated, then threw open the door. Well, come in, said she. My husband is not afraid to face any man in the world. She closed the door behind us and showed us into a sitting room on the right-hand side of the hall, turning up the gas as she left. Mr. Peters will be with you in an instant, said she. Her words were literally true, for we had hardly time to look around the dusty and moth-eaten apartment in which we had found ourselves before the door opened and a big, clean-shaven, bald-headed man stepped lightly in the room. He had a large red face with pendulous cheeks and a general air of superficial benevolence which was marred by a cruel, vicious mouth.
There's surely some mistake here, gentlemen,
he said in an unctuous, make-everything-easy voice.
I fancy that you have been misdirected. Possibly have you tried farther down the street?
That will do. We have no time to waste, said my companion firmly. You are Henry Peters of Adelaide, late of the Reverend Dr. Schlesinger of Baden and South America. I am sure that you have my own name. That is Sherlock Holmes. Peters, as we should now call him, started and stared hard at his formidable pursuer.
I guess your name does not frighten me, Mr. Holmes, he said coolly. When a man's conscience is easy, you can't rattle him. What is your business in my house?
I want to know what you have done with the Lady Frances Carfax, whom you brought away with you from Baden.
I'll be very glad to tell you where the lady may be,
Peters answered coolly.
I've a bill against her for nearly £200, and nothing to show for it but a couple of trumpery pendants that her dealer would hardly look at. She attached herself to Mrs. Peters and me at Baden. It is a fact that I was using another name at the time, and she struck on to us until we came to London. I paid her bill and her ticket. Once in London, she gave us the slip, and, as I say, left these out-of-date jewels to pay her bills. You will find her, Mr. Holmes, and I'm your debtor.
I mean to find her, said Sherlock Holmes. I'm going through this house until I do find her.
Where's your arrest warrant?
Holmes drew a revolver from his pocket. You'll have to serve till the better one comes.
Why, you are a common burglar.
So you might describe me, said Holmes cheerfully. My companion is also a dangerous ruffian, and together we are going through your house. Our opponent opened the door.
Fetch a policeman, Annie,
said he. There was a whisk of feminine skirts down the passage, and the hall door was opened and shut. Our time is limited, Watson, said Holmes. If you try to stop us, Peters, you will certainly get hurt. Where is the coffin which was brought into your house?
What do you want with the coffin? It is in use. There is a body in it.
I must see the body.
Never with my consent.
And then without it. With a quick movement, Holmes pushed the fellow to one side and passed into the hall. A door half open stood immediately before us. We entered, and it was a dining room. On the table, under a half-lit chandelier, the coffin was lying. Holmes turned up the gas and raised the lid. Deep down in the recess of the coffin lay an emancipated figure. The glare from the lights had beat on an aged and weathered face. By no possible process of cruelty, starvation, or disease could this worn-out wreck be the still beauty of Lady Frances. Holmes's face showed his amazement, and also his relief. "Thank God," he muttered, "it's someone else." "You've blundered badly for once, Mr. Sherlock Holmes," said Peters as he followed us in the room. "Who's this dead woman?"
"Well, if you really must know, she is the old nurse of my wife's, Rose Spender, her name, whom we found in Brixton Workhouse Infirmary. We brought her round here, called in Dr. Horton of 13 Fairbanks Villas. Mind you, take the address, Mr. Holmes. And he had certified attended, and Christian folk should. On the third day she died. Certificate says senile decay, but that's only one doctor's opinion, and of course you know better. We ordered her funeral to be carried out by Stimson & Co. of Kensington Road, who will bury her at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. Can you pick any hole in that, Mr. Holmes?"
You've made a silly blunder, and you may as well own up to it. I'd give something for a photograph of your gaping, staring face when you pulled aside the lid, expecting to see Lady Frances Carfax, and only found a poor old woman of 90. Holmes's expression was impassive as ever under the jeers of his antagonist, but his clenched hands betrayed his acute annoyance. "I am going through your house," said he. "Are you, though?" cried Peters, as a woman's voice and heavy steps sounded in the passage. "We'll soon see about that. This way, officers, if you please. These men have forced their way into my house, and I cannot get rid of them. Help me to put them out." The sergeant and the constable stood in the doorway. Holmes drew his card from his case. "This is my name and address, and this is my friend, Dr. Watson." "Thank you, sir. We know very well who you are," said the sergeant, "but you can't stay here without a warrant." "Of course not. I quite understand that." "Arrest him." "We know where to lay our hands on this gentleman if he is wanted," said the sergeant majestically. "But you'll have to go, Mr. Holmes." "Yes, Watson, we shall have to go." A minute later we were in the street once more. Holmes was as cool as ever, but I was hot with anger and humiliation. The sergeant had followed us. "Sorry, Mr. Holmes, but that's the law." "Exactly, Sergeant. You could do no otherwise." "I expect there was a good reasons for your presence there, if there's anything I can do." "It's a missing lady, Sergeant, and we think that she is in the house. I expect a warrant presently." "Then I'll keep my eye on the parties, Mr. Holmes. If anything comes along, I'll surely let you know." It was only 9 o'clock, and we were full cry upon the trail at once. First we drove to Brixton Workhouse Infirmary, where we found that it was indeed the truth from a charitable couple had called some days before, that they had claimed an imbecile old woman as a former servant, and that they had obtained permission to take her away with them. No surprise was expressed at the news that the old woman had since died. The doctor was our next call. He had been called in, had found the woman dying of pure senility, had actually seen her pass away, and had signed the certificate in due form. "I assure you that everything is perfectly normal, and there was no foul play from the matter," he said. Nothing in the house had struck him as suspicious, save that the people of their class, it was remarkable that they should have no servants. So far, no further went the doctor. Finally, we found our way to Scotland Yard. There had been some difficulties in the procedure in regard to the warrant. Some delay was inevitable. The magistrate's signature might not be obtained until next morning. If Holmes would call about 9, he could go down to Lestrade and see it acted upon. So ended the day, and save near midnight our friend, the sergeant, called to say that he had been seeing flickering lights here and there in the windows of the great dark house, but that no one had left it and none had entered. We could but pray for patience, and wait for that tomorrow. Sherlock Holmes was too irritable for conversation and too restless for sleep. I left him smoking hard, with his heavy dark brows knotted together, and his long nervous fingers tapping upon the arm of his chair, as he turned over in his mind every possible solution to the mystery. Several times in the course of the night I heard him prowling about the house. Finally, just after I had been called in the morning, he rushed into my room. He was in his dressing gown, but his pale, hollow-eyed face told me that this night had been a sleepless one. "What time is the funeral? 8, was it not?" he asked eagerly. "Well, it is 7:20 now. Good heavens, Watson, what has become of my brains the gods have given me? Quick, man, quick! It's life or death. 100 chances on death to 1 to life. I'll never forgive myself. Never, if we are too late." 5 minutes had not passed before we were flying in a hansom down Baker Street. But even so, it was 25 to 8 as we passed Big Ben. The 8 struck as we tore down Brixton Road, but others were late as well as we. 10 minutes after the hour, the hearse was still standing at the door of the house, and even our own foaming horse came to a halt to the coffin, supported by 2 or 3 men appearing in the threshold. Holmes darted forward and barred their way. "Take it back!" he cried, laying his hand on the breast of the foremost. "Take it back this instant." "What the devil do you mean? Once again I ask you, where's your warrant?" shouted furious Peters, his big red face glaring over the farther end of the coffin.
The warrant is on its way. The coffin shall remain in the house until it comes.
The authority in Holmes's voice had its effect upon the bearers. Peters had suddenly vanished into the house, and they obeyed these new orders.
Quick, Watson, quick! Where is the screwdriver?
He shouted as the coffin was replaced on the table.
Here's one for you, my man. A sovereign if the lid comes off in a minute. Ask no questions. Work. Away. That's good. Another. And another. Now pull all together. It's giving. It's giving. Ah, yes, that does it.
With a united effort, we tore off the coffin lid. As we did so, there came from inside a stupefying and overpowering smell of chloroform. A body lay within, its head all wreathed with cotton wool, which had been soaked in the narcotic. Holmes plucked it off and disclosed the grotesque face of the handsome and spiritual woman of middle age. For an instant, he had passed his arm around the figure and raised her to a sitting position.
Is she gone, Watson? Is there a spark left? Surely that is not too late.
For half an hour it seemed that we were. With that actual suffocation, and that with the poisonous fumes of the chloroform, Lady Francis seemed to have passed at the last point of recall. And then, at last, with artificial respiration and injected ether, and every device that science could suggest, some flutter of life, some quiver of the eyelids, some dimming of her mirror, spoke of slowly returning life. A cab had driven up, and Holmes, parting the blind, looked out it.
Here's the start with a warrant, he said. You will find that his birds have flown, and here,
he added with his heavy sweep during the long passage,
is someone who has a better right to nurse this lady than we have. Good morning, Mr. Green. I think that the sooner we move the Lady Francis the better. Meanwhile, the funeral may proceed, and the poor old woman who still lies in that coffin may go to her last resting place. Should you care to add to that case in your annals, my dear Watson,
said Holmes that evening,
it can only be as an example of temporary eclipse to which the best balanced mind may be exposed. Such slips are common to all mortals, and the greatest is he who can recognize and repair them. To this modified credits I may, perhaps, make some claim. My night was haunted by the thought that somewhere a clue, a strange sentence, a curious observation, had come under my notice and had been too easily dismissed. Then suddenly, in the grey of morning, the words came back to me. It was a remark of the undertaker's wife, as reported by Philip Green. She had said, "It should be there before now. It took longer, being out of the ordinary." It was a coffin of which she spoke. It had been out of the ordinary. That could only mean that it had been made for some special measurement. But why? Why? Then in an instant I remembered the deep sides, and the little wasted figure at the bottom. Why so large a coffin for so small a body? To leave room for another body, both which would be buried under one certificate. It had to be so clear if I had seen my own sight had not been dimmed. At 8 the Lady Francis would be buried. Our one chance was to stop the coffin before it left the house. It was a desperate chance that we might find her alive, but it was a chance, as the result showed. These people had never, to my knowledge, done a murder. They might shrink from actual violence at the last, but they could bury her with no sign of how she met her end, and even if she had been exhumed, there was a chance for them. I hoped that such considerations might prevail with them. You can reconstruct the scene well enough. You saw the horrible den upstairs, where the poor old lady had been kept so long. They rushed in and overpowered her with the chloroform, carried her down, poured more into the coffin to ensure against her waking, then screwed down the lid. A clever device, Watson. It is new to me in the annals of crime. If our ex-missionary friends escape the clutches of Lestrade, I shall expect to hear some brilliant incidents in the future career.
Ooh. That was cool.
Takes longer for a deeper coffin, I guess. Custom specs. Tony did rate in. Okay. I didn't have my chat open. Thank you for the raid, Oni. I knew I'd done the auto shout out, so. Okay. Okay, I like the rhyming ones that they're doing now. Punching T-Rexes? Okay, yeah. Oh, and the pre-roll's already gone, so I guess I can go ahead and get into the second story. I may be able to finish it. And it's not even 10 yet. Cool. Which means I may only have one more week of Sherlock Holmes. So, our second story. Get a hydrate again. I guess I'm still alive. Only by luck of having the two Wi-Fi units going at the same time. Which I guess I could just run a hard line, but I don't want to do that yet. Hopefully, if and when I get a new computer, I'll go ahead and just set up a regular place to do all the readings and actually use a proper desk as opposed to just the laptop. But anyway, our next story from these Tales of 221B. The Adventure of the Devil's Foot. In recording from time to time some of the curious experiences and interesting recollections which I associate with my long and intimate friendship with Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I have continually been faced with difficulties caused by his own aversion to publicity. To a somber and cynical spirit, all popular applause was always abhorrent, and nothing amused him more at the end of a successful case than hand over the actual exposure to some orthodox official, and to listen with a mocking smile and general chorus of misplaced congratulation. It was indeed this attitude upon the part of my friend, and was certainly not any lack of interesting material, which has caused me of late years to lay very few of my records before the public. My participation in some of his adventures was always a privilege which entailed me a direction and reticence upon me. It was, then, with considerable surprise that I received a telegram from Holmes last Tuesday. He has never been known to write a telegram or serve, in the following terms: "Why not tell them of the Cornish horror, the strangest case I've handled?" I have no idea what backward sweep of memory had brought the matter fresh to his mind, or what freak had caused him to desire that I should recount it. But I hasten before another cancelling telegram may arrive to hunt out the notes which give me the exact details of the case, and to lay the narrative before you, my readers. It was, then, in the spring of the year 1897, that Holmes' iron constitution showed some symptoms of giving way in the face of a constant hard work and most exacting kind, aggravated, perhaps, by occasional indiscretions of his own. In March of that year, Dr. Moore Agar of Harley Street, whose dramatic introduction to Holmes I may some day recount, gave positive injunctions that this famous private agent
would lay aside all his cases and surrender himself to complete rest if he wished to avert an absolute breakdown. That state of his health was not the matter in which he himself took in the faintest interest, for his mental detachment was absolute, but he was induced at last, on the threat of being permanently disqualified from work, to give himself a complete change of scene and air. Thus it was that in the early spring of that year we found ourselves together in a small cottage near Porto Bay, at the further extremity of the Cornish peninsula. It was a singular spot, and one particularly well suited for the grim humour of my patient. From the windows of our little whitewashed house, which stood high upon a grassy headland, we looked down upon the whole sinister semicircle of Mounts Bay, an old death-trap of sailing vessels, with its fringe and black cliffs and surge-swept reefs on which innumerable seamen had met their end. With a northerly breeze it lies placid and sheltered, inviting the storm-tossed craft to track it into rest and protection. Then comes a sudden swirl around of the wind, the blustering gale from the southwest, the dragging anchor, the lee shore, and the last battle and the creaming breakers. The wise mariner stands far out from that evil place. On the seaside our surroundings were as sombre as the sea. It was a country of rolling moors, lonely, dun-coloured, with occasional church tower to mark the site of some old-world village. In every direction upon these moors there were traces of some vanished race, which had passed utterly away, and left as its sole record strange monuments of stone, irregular mounds which contained the burned ashes of the dead, and the curious earthworks which hinted at prehistoric strife. The glamour and mystery of the place, with its sinister atmosphere and forgotten nations, appealed to the imagination of my friend, and he spent much time on long walks and solitary meditations upon the moor. The ancient Cornish language had also arrested his attention, and he had, I remember, conceived the idea that it was akin to the Chaldean, and that had been largely derived from Phoenician readers in 10. He had received consignment of books upon philology, and was settling down to develop his thesis, when suddenly, to my sorrow, and to his unfeigned delight, we found ourselves in the land of dreams, plunged into a problem at our very doors, which was more intense, more engrossing, and infinitely more mysterious than any of those which had driven us from London. Our simple life was precipitated into the midst of the series of events which caused the utmost excitement, not only in Cornwall, but throughout the whole west of England. Many of my readers may retain the recollection of what was called at the time the Cornish Horror. Thought the most imperfect account of the matter reached the London press. Now, after 13 years, I will give the true details of this inconceivable affair to the public. I have said that the scattered towers marked the villages which dotted this wall of Cornwall. The nearest of these was hamlet of Tredennick Wallace, where the cottages of a couple of hundred inhabitants clustered round an ancient, moss-grown church. The vicar of the parish, Mr. Roundhay, was something of an archaeologist, and as such Holmes made his acquaintance. He was a middle-aged man, portly and affable, with a considerable fund of local store. At his invitation, we had taken tea in the vicarage, and had come to know also Mr. Mortimer Turgenis, an independent gentleman who's increased the clergyman's scanty resources by taking rooms in his large, straggling house. The vicar, being a bachelor, was glad to come to such an arrangement, though he had little in common with his lodger, who was a tall, thin, bespectacled man, with a stoop which gave him the impression of an actual physical deformity. I remember that during our short visit we found the vicar garrulous, but his lodger was strangely reticent, a sad-faced, introspective man, sitting with averted eyes, brooding apparently upon his own affairs. These were the two men who entered abruptly into our little sitting-room on Tuesday, March the 16th, shortly after our breakfast hour, as we were smoking together, preparatory to our daily excursion upon the moors. "Mr. Holmes," said the vicar in an agitated voice, "the most extraordinary and tragic affair has occurred during the night. It is the most unheard-of business. We can only regard it as some providence that you should chance to be here at the time. For in all of England you're the one man we need. I glared at the intrusive vicar with no friendly eyes, but Holmes took his pipe from his lips and sat up in his chair like an old hound who hears a view hullo. He waved his hand to the sofa, and our palpitating visitor, with his agitated companion, sat by side on it. Mr. Mortimer Terragrit was more self-contained than the clergyman, but the twitching of his thin hands and the brightness of his dark eyes shows that they shared a common emotion.
"Shall I speak or you?" asked the vicar. "Oh, you seem to have made the discovery, whatever it may be, and the vicar to have it second hand. Perhaps you had better do the speaking," said Holmes.
I glanced at the hastily clad clergyman with the formally dressed lodger seated beside him, with an amused at the surprise Miss Holmes' simple deduction had brought to their faces.
"Perhaps I had best say the few words first," said the vicar, "and then you can judge if you will listen to the details of Mr. Tregennis, and whether or not we should hasten to the scene of the mysterious affair. I may explain, then, that our friend here spent last evening in the company of his two brothers, Owen and George, and his sister Brenda, at their house in the Trenwick Warther, which is near the old stone cross upon the moor. When he left them shortly after 10 o'clock, playing cards round the dining-room table, in excellent health and spirits, this morning, being an early riser, he walked from that direction before breakfast, and was overtaken by the carriage of Dr. Richards, who explained that he had just been sent for a most urgent call to Trenwick Warther. Mr. Mortimer Tregennis naturally went with him. When he arrived at Trenwick Warther, he found an extraordinary state of things. His two brothers and his sisters were seated around the table exactly as he had left them, the cards still spread in front of them, and the candles burnt down to their sockets. The sister lay back stone dead in her chair, while her two brothers sat on either side of her, laughing and shouting and singing, their senses stricken clear out of them. All three of them, the dead woman and the two demented men, retained upon their faces an expression of utmost horror, a convulsion of terror which was dreadful to look on. There was no sign of the presence of anyone in the house except Mrs. Porter, the old cook and housekeeper, who declared that she had slept deeply and heard no sound during the night. Nothing had been stolen or disarranged, and there is absolutely no explanation of what the horror which could be frightened a woman to death and two strong men out of their senses. There's the situation, Mr. Holmes, in a nutshell, and if you can help us to clear it up, you will have done a great work.
I had hoped that in some way I could coax my companion back into the quiet which had been the object of our journey, but one glance at his intense face and contracted eyebrows told me how in vain was now the expectation. He sat for some little time in the silence, absorbed in the strange drama which had broken upon our peace.
"I will look into this matter," he said at last. "On the face of it, it would appear to be a case of a very exceptional nature. Have you been there yourself, Mr. Runby?"
"Oh, Mr. Holmes, Mr. Tregennis brought back the account to the vicarage, and I at once hurried him over to consult you."
"How far is it from the house where the singular tragedy occurred?"
"About a mile inland."
"Then we shall walk there together. But before we start, I must ask you a few questions, Mr. Mortimer Tregennis."
The other had been silent all this time, but I had observed that his more controlled excitement was even greater than the obtrusive emotion of the clergyman. He sat with a pale, drawn face, his anxious gaze fixed upon Holmes, and his thin hands clasped convulsively together. His pale lips quivered as he listened to the dreadful experience which had befallen his family, and his dark eyes seemed to reflect something of the horror of the scene. "Ask what you like, Mr. Holmes," he said eagerly. "It is a bad thing to speak of, but I will answer you the truth."
"Tell me about last night."
"Well, Mr. Holmes, I supped there, as the vicar had said, and my elder brother George proposed a game of whist afterwards. We sat down till 9 o'clock. It was 10:15 when I moved to go. I left them all round the table, as merry as could be."
"Who let you out?"
"Miss Porter had gone to bed, so I let myself out. I shut the hall door behind me. The window of the room in which they sat was closed, but the blind had not been drawn down. There was no change in the door and window this morning, nor for any reason to think that any stranger had been in the house. And yet, there they sat, driven clean mad with terror, and Brenda lying dead of fright, with her head hanging over her arm on the chair. I'll never get the sight of the room out of my mind, as long as I live."
facts, as you state them, are certainly most remarkable, said Holmes. I take it that you have no theory yourself which can be the way out of them.
It's the devil, Mr. Holmes, the devil, cried Mortimer Trenigus. It's not of this world. Something has come into that room and dashed the light and reason out of their eyes. What human contrivance could do that?
I fear, said Holmes, that is a matter of beyond humanity is certainly beyond me. Yet we must exhaust all natural explanations before we fall back onto such a theory as this. As to yourself, Mr. Trenigus, I take it that you were divided in some way from your family since they lived together and you had rooms apart.
That is so, Mr. Holmes, though the matter is past and done with. We're a family of 10 miners in Redruth, but we sold out our venture to the company and so retired with enough to keep us. I won't deny that there was some feeling of the division of the money and it stood between us for some time, but it was all forgiven and forgotten, and we were the best of friends together.
Looking back at the evening upon you spent together, does anything stand out in the memory as throwing any possible light of the tragedy? Think carefully, Mr. Tregennis, for any clue which might help me.
There's nothing at all, sir.
Your people were in their usual spirits?
Never better.
Were they nervous people? Did they ever show any apprehension of coming danger?
Nothing of the kind.
You have nothing to add, then, which could assist me.
Mortimer Tregennis considered earnestly for a moment.
There is one thing that occurs to me, he said at last. As we sat with my table back to the window, and my brother George, being a partner in cards, I was facing him. I saw him look once hard over my shoulder, so I turned around and looked also. But the blind was up and the window shut. But I could just make out the bushes of the lawn. It seemed to me for a moment that he saw something move among them. I couldn't say if it was man or animal, but I just thought that there was something there. When I asked him what he was looking at, he told me that he had had some feeling. That was all I have to say. Did you not investigate?
No, the matter passes unimportant.
You left them, then, without any premonition of evil?
None at all.
I am not clear how you came to hear the news so early this morning.
I'm an early riser and generally take a walk before breakfast. This morning I had hardly started when the doctor in his carriage overtook me. He told me that old Miss Porter had sent the boy down with an urgent message, and I sprang in beside him and we drove on.
When we got there, we looked into that dreadful room. The candles and fire must have been burnt out hours before, and they were all sitting there in the dark until dawn had broken. The doctor said Brenda must have been dead at least 6 hours. There was no signs of violence. She just lay across the arm of her chair with that look on her face. George and Owen were singing snatches of songs and gibbering like two great apes. It was awful to see. I couldn't stand it, and the doctor was as white as a sheet. Indeed, he fell into a chair at the sort of faint, and we nearly had him on our hands as well.
Remarkable, most remarkable, said Holmes, rising and taking his hat.
I think, perhaps, we had better go down to Treadmoor Wather without further delay. I confess that I have seldom known a case which at first sight presented a more singular problem.
Our proceedings of the first morning did little to advance the investigation. It was marked, however, at the onset of an incident which left the most sinister impression upon my mind. The approach to the spot at which the tragedy occurred is down a narrow, winding country lane. While we made our way along it, we heard a rattle of a carriage coming towards us, and stood aside to let it pass. As it drove by, I caught a glimpse through the closed window of a horribly contorted, grinning face glaring out at us. Those staring eyes and ghastly gnashing teeth flashed past like a dreadful vision. "My brothers!" cried Mortimer Trenigus, white to his lips. "They're taking him to Helston." We looked with horror at the black carriage lumbering upon its way. Then we turned our steps towards the ill-omened house in which they had met their strange fate. It was a large and bright dwelling, rather a villa than a cottage, with a considerable garden which was already, in that Cornish air, well filled with spring flowers. Towards the garden the window of the sitting-room fronted, and from it, according to Mortimer Trenigus, must have come that thing of evil in which by sheer horror in a single instant blasted their minds. Holmes walked slowly and thoroughly among the flower pots and along the path before we entered the porch. So absorbed was he in his thoughts, I remember, that he stumbled over the watering pot, upset its contents, and deluged both our feet in the garden path. Inside the house we were met by the elderly Cornish housekeeper, Mrs. Porter, who, with the aid of a young girl, looked after the wants of the family. She readily answered all Holmes's questions. She had heard nothing in the night, her employers had all been in excellent spirits lately, and she had never known them to be more cheerful or prosperous. She had fainted with horror upon entering the room in the morning, and had seen the dreadful company round the table. She had, when she recovered, thrown open the window to let in the morning air, and in the run hauled down the lane, she sent the farm lad to the doctor. The lady was in her bed upstairs, if we cared to see her. It took a strong man from the brothers to the asylum carriage. She would not herself stay in the house under a day, and was starting that very afternoon to rejoin her family at St. Ives. We ascended the stairs and viewed the body. Miss Brenda Tregennis had been a very beautiful girl, though now verging upon middle age. Her dark, clear-cut face was handsome, even in death, but there still lingered upon it something that had convulsion of horror which had been her last human emotion. From her bedroom we descended to the sitting-room where this strange tragedy had actually occurred. The charred ashes overnight lay in the fire. The table were the 4 guttered and burnt-out candles, with the cards scattered over its surface. The chairs had been moved round back against the wall, but all else was as it had been the night before. Holmes paced with light, swift steps about the room. He sat in various chairs, drawing them up and reconstructing their positions. He tested how much of the garden was visible. He examined the floor, the ceiling, and the fireplace. But never once did I see that sudden brightening of his eyes and tightening of his lips, which would have told me that he saw some gleam of light in this utter darkness. "Why a fire?" he asked at once. Had they always a fire in this small room on a spring evening? Mortimer Tregennis explained that that night was cold and damp. For that reason, after his arrival, the fire was lit. "What are you going to do about it now, Mr. Holmes?" he asked. My friend smiled and laid his hand upon his arm. "I think, Watson, that I shall resume the course of tobacco poisoning which you have often so justly condemned," said he. "With your permission, gentlemen, we will now return to our cottage, for I am not aware that any new factor is likely to come to our notice here. I will turn the facts over in my mind, Mr. Tregennis, and should anything occur to me, I will certainly communicate with you and the vicar. In the meantime, I wish you both a good morning." It was not long until we were back at the Potu cottage that Holmes broke his complete and absorbed silence. He sat coiled in his armchair, his haggard and ascetic face hardly visible amid the blue swirl of his tobacco smoke, his black brows drawn down and his forehead contracted, his eyes vacant and far away. Finally he laid down his pipe and sprang to his feet. "It won't do, Watson," he said with a laugh. "Let us walk along the cliffs together and search for flint arrows. We are more likely to find them than clues to this problem. To let the brain work without sufficient material is like racing an engine. It racks itself to pieces. The open sea air, the sunshine, and patience, Watson. All else will come. Now, let us calmly define our position, Watson," he continued as we skirted the cliffs together. "Let us get a firm grip of the very little which we do know, so that the fresh facts arise we may be ready to fit them into their places. I take it, in the first place, that neither of us is prepared to admit diabolical intrusions into the affairs of men. Let us begin by ruling that entirely out of our minds. Very good. There remain 3 persons who have been grievously stricken by some conscious or unconscious human agency. That is a firm ground. Now, when did this occur? Evidently, assuming from his narrative to be true, it was immediately after Mr. Mortimer Tregennis had left the room. That is a very important point. The presumption is that it was in the few minutes afterwards. The cards still lay upon the table. It was already past their usual hour for bed. They had not changed their position or pushed back their chairs, I repeat. Then that occurrence was immediately after his departure, and not later than 11 o'clock at night.
Our next obvious step is to check, so far as we can, the movements of Mortimer Tregennis after he left the room. Unless there is no difficulty, as I seem to be above suspicion. Knowing my methods as you do, you were, of course, suspicious of the somewhat clumsy water party expedients, by which I obtained a clearer imprint of his foot that might otherwise have been impossible. The wet, sandy path took it admirably. Last night was also wet, you will remember, and it was not difficult, having obtained a simple print, to pick out his track among the others to follow his movements. He appears to have walked away swiftly in the direction of the vicarage. If, then, Mortimer Tregennis disappeared from the scene, and yet some outside person affected the card players, how can we reconstruct that person, and how was such an impression of horror conveyed? Mrs. Porter may be eliminated. She is evidently harmless. Is there any evidence that someone crept up to the garden window in some manner to produce so terrific an effect that drove those who saw it out of their senses? The only suggestion is the direction comes from Mortimer Tregennis himself, who says that his brother spoke out about some movement in the garden. And that is remarkably certain, as the night was rainy, cloudy, and dark. Anyone who have had the design to alarm these people would be compelled to place his very face against a glass before he could be seen. There is a 3-foot flower border outside the window, but no indication of a footmark. It is difficult to imagine, then, how an outsider could have been so terrible an impression upon the company, nor have we found any possible motive for so strange and elaborate an attempt. You perceive our difficulties, Watson.
"They are only too clear," I answered with conviction.
"And yet, with a little more material, we may prove that they are not insurmountable," said Holmes. "I fancy that among your intensive archives, Watson, you may find some which were nearly as obscure. Meanwhile, we shall put the case aside until more accurate data are available, and devote the rest of our morning to the pursuit of Neolithic man."
I may have commented upon my friend's power of mental detachment, but I never have wondered at it more than upon the spring morning in Cornwall, when for 2 hours he discerned upon celts, arrowheads, and shards, as lightly as if no sinister mystery was waiting for his solution. It was not until we had returned in the afternoon to our cottage that we found a visitor waiting us, who soon brought our minds back to the matter at hand. Neither of us needed to be told who that visitor was. The huge body, the craggy and deeply seamed face with fierce eyes and hawk-like nose, and grizzled hair which was nearly brushed our cottage ceiling. The beard, golden in fringes with white near the lips, gave the nicotine stain from the perpetual cigars. All these were known in London as in Africa, and could only be associated with the tremendous personality of Dr. Leon Sterndale, the great lion hunter and explorer. We had heard of his presence in the district, and had once or twice caught sight of this tall figure upon the moorland pass. He made no advance to us, however, nor would we have dreamed of doing so to him, as it is known that it is his love of seclusion which caused him to spend the greater part of the intervals between his journeys in a small bungalow buried in the lonely wood at Beauchamp-Ariens. Here, amid his books and his maps, he lived an absolutely lonely life, attending to his own simple wants, and paying little apparent heed to the affairs of his neighbors. It was a surprise to me, therefore, to hear him asking Holmes in an eager voice whether he had made any advance in his reconstruction of the mysterious episode.
"The country police are utterly at fault," said he, "but perhaps your wider experience has suggested some conceivable explanation. My only claim to being taken in your confidence is that during the many residences here I have come to know this family of Tregennis very well. Indeed, upon my Cornish mother's side, I could call them cousins, and their strange fate has naturally been a great shock to me. I may tell you that I got as far as Plymouth upon my way to Africa, but the news reached me this morning, and I came straight back to help in the inquiry."
Holmes raised his eyebrows.
"Did you lose your boat through it?"
"I will take the next."
"Dear me, that is friendship indeed."
"I tell you they were relatives."
"Quite so. Cousins of your mother. Was there baggage aboard the ship?"
"Some of it, but the main part at the hotel."
"I see. But surely this event could not have found its way into Plymouth morning papers?"
"No, sir. I had the telegram."
"Might I ask from whom?"
shadow passed over the gaunt faces of the explorer.
You're very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business. With an effort, Dr. Sterndale recovered his ruffled composure.
I have no objection to telling you, said he. It was Mr. Roundhay, the vicar, who sent me the telegram which recalled me.
Thank you, said Holmes. I may say in answer to your original question, I have not cleared my mind entirely on the subject of the matter, but that I have every hope in reaching some conclusion. I would be premature to say more.
No, I can hardly answer that. Perhaps you could not mind telling me if your suspicions point to any particular direction.
No, I can hardly answer that.
Then I have wasted my time and do not need prolong my visit.
The famous doctor strode out of our cottage in considerable ill humour, and within 5 minutes Holmes had followed him. I saw him no more until the evening, and when he returned with a slow step and haggard face which assured me that he had made no great progress in his investigation, he glanced at his telegram which awaited him, and threw it into the grate.
From the Plymouth Hotel, Watson, he said. I learned the name of it from the vicar, and I wired to certain people to make Dr. Leon Sterndale's account was true. It appeared that he did indeed spend last night there, and that he actually allowed some of his baggage to go into Africa while he returned to present at this investigation. What do you make of that, Watson?
He is deeply interested.
Deeply interested, yes. There is a thread there which we have not yet grasped, and which might lead us through the tangle. Cheer up, Watson, for I am very sure that our material has not yet come at hand. When it does, we may soon leave our difficulties behind us.
Little did I think how soon the words of Holmes would be realized, or how strange and sinister would be the new development which opened up an entirely fresh line of investigation. I was shaving at the window in the morning when I heard a little rattle of hoofs, and looking up, saw a dog-cart coming at a gallop down the road. I pulled up at our door, and our friend the vicar sprang from it and rushed up our garden path. Holmes was already dressed, and we hastened down to meet him. Our visitor was so excited that he could hardly articulate, but at last in gasps, burst and tragic story came out of him. "We're devil-risen, Mr. Holmes. My poor parish is devil-ridden," he cried. "Satan himself is on the loose in it. We are given over into his hands." He glanced about in his agitation, a ludicrous object as if it were not, from his ashy face and startled eyes. Finally he shot out his terrible news. "Mr. Mortimer Tregennis died during the night, and with the exact same symptoms as the rest of his family." Holmes sprang to his feet, all energy in an instant. "Can you fit us both in your dog-cart?" "Yes, I can." "Then, Watson, we will postpone our breakfast. Mr. Roundhay, we are extremely at your disposal. Hurry, hurry, before things get disarranged." The lodger occupied 2 rooms of the vicarage, which were at an angle by themselves, one above the other. Below was a large sitting room, and above his bedroom. He looked out upon the croquet lawn which came up to the windows. He had arrived before the doctor or the police, so that everything was absolutely undisturbed. Let me describe exactly the scene as we saw it upon that misty March morning that has left an impression which can never be effaced from my mind. The atmosphere of the room was of a horrible and depressing stiffness. The servant who had first entered had thrown up the window, or it would have been even more intolerable. This might partly be to the fact that the lamp was stood flaring and smoking at the center table. Beside it sat the dead man, leaning back in his chair, his thin beard projecting, his spectacles pushed up on his forehead, and his lean, dark face turned towards the window, and twisted into the same distortion of terror which had marked the feature of his dead sister. His limbs were convulsed, and his fingers contorted, as though he had died in the very paroxysm of fear. He was fully clothed, though there were signs that his dressing had been done in a hurry. We had already learned that his bed had been slept in, and that the tragic end had come to him in the early morning. One realized the red-hot energy which underlay Holmes's phlegmatic exterior when he saw the sudden change which came over him in the moment that he entered the fatal apartment. In an instant he was tense and alert, his eyes shining, his face set, his limbs quivering with eager activity. He was out on his lawn, and out through the window, and round the room, up the bedroom, and for all the world dashing foxhound drawing a cover. In the bedroom he made a rapid cast about, and ended up by throwing open the window, which appeared to give him some fresh cause of excitement, for he leaned out with loud ejaculations of interest and delight. Then he rushed down the stairs, out through the open window, and threw himself down upon his face on the lawn, sprang up into the room once more with all the energy of a hunter who is at the very heels of his quarry. The lamp, which was extraordinarily standard, he examined with minute care, making certain measurements upon its bowl. He carefully scrutinized with his lens the talc shield which covered the top of the chimney, and scraped some of the ashes which adhered to its upper surface, putting some of them into an envelope, which he placed into his pocketbook. Finally, just as the doctor and the official police had arrived in appearance, he beckoned the vicar, and all three went out upon the lawn. "I am glad to say that my investigation has not been entirely barren," he remarked. "I cannot remain to discuss the matter with the police, but I should be exceedingly obliged, Mr. Roundhay, if you would allow the inspector and give him my compliments and direct his attention to the bedroom window and to the sitting-room lamp. Each is suggestive, and together they are almost conclusive. If the police would desire any further information, I shall be happy to see any of them at the cottage. Now, Watson, I think that perhaps we shall be better employed elsewhere." It may be that the police resented the intrusion of an amateur, or that they imagined themselves to be upon some hopeful line of an investigation, but it was certain that we heard nothing from them for the next 2 days. During this time, Holmes spent some of his time smoking and dreaming in the cottage, but a greater portion of the country walks which he undertook alone, returning after many hours without remark as to where he had been. One experiment showed me that in the line of his investigation he had brought a lamp which was a duplicate of that which burned in the room of Mortimer Treneganis on the morning of the tragedy. He had filled it with the same oil that was used in the vicarage, and he carefully timed the position of which it would take to be exhausted. Another experiment which he made was of a more unpleasant nature, and one which I am not likely to ever forget. "You remember, Watson," he remarked one afternoon, "that there is a common point of resemblance in every varying report that reaches us. This concerns the effect of the atmosphere in the room in which case had been first entered. You'll recollect that Mortimer Tregennis, in describing the episode of his last visit to his brother's house, remarked that the doctor had entered the room and fell into a chair. You had forgotten. Well, I can answer for that what it is now. You'll remember that Mrs. Porter, the housekeeper, told us that she herself fainted upon entering the room and had afterwards opened a window. In the second case, that of Mortimer Tregennis himself, you cannot have forgotten that horrible stiffness of the room when we arrived, though the servant had thrown open the window. That servant, I found upon inquiry, was so ill that she had gone to bed. You'll admit, Watson, that these facts are very suggestive. In each of these evidence of a poisonous atmosphere. In each case, also, there is a combustion going on in the room. In one case the fire, in the other the lamp. The fire was needed, and the lamp was lit, as the comparisons the oil consumed will show, long after it was broad daylight. Why? Surely because it was a connection between these three things: the burning, the stuffy atmosphere, and finally, the madness or death of those unfortunate people. That is clear, is it not?
It would appear so.
At least we may accept that as a working hypothesis. We will suppose, then, that something was burned in each case which produced an atmosphere causing strange toxic effects. Very good. In the first instance, that of the Tregennis family, the substance was placed in the fire. Now the window was shut, but the fire would naturally carry fumes to some extent up the chimney. Hence, one would expect the effects of the poison to be less than that of the second case, where there was less escape for the vapor. The result seems to indicate that it is so, since in the first case only the woman, who had presumably been more sensible organism, was killed, the others exhibiting a temporary or permanent lunacy, which is evident in the first effect of the drug. In the second case, the result was complete. These facts, therefore, seem to bear out the theory that the poison which worked
by combustion. With this train of reasoning in my head, I naturally looked about the Mortimer Trenegas' room to find the same remains of the substance. The obvious place was to look was a talc shield, a smoke guard of the lamp. Sure, there enough, I perceived a number of flaky ashes, and round the edges of the fringe of brownish powder, which had not been consumed. Half of this I took, as you saw, and placed it in an envelope.
Why half, Holmes?
It is not for me, my dear Watson, to stand in the way of the official police force. I leave them all the evidence which is found. The poison still remained in the talc, and they had the wits to find it. Now, Watson, we will light our lamp. We will, however, take the precaution to open our window to avoid the premature decease of the two deserving members of society. And you will seat yourself near the open window in the armchair. Thus, like a sensible man, you determine to have nothing to do with the affair. Oh, you will see it out, will you, Watson? A thought on you, my Watson. This chair I will place opposite yours, so that we may have the same distance from the poison, face to face. The door we will leave ajar. Each is now in a position to watch the other to bring the experiment to an end should the symptoms seem alarming. Is that all clear? Well then, I take our powder, or what remains of it, from the envelope, and I lay it above the burning lamp. So, now, Watson, let us sit down and wait our developments.
They were not long in coming. I had hardly settled into my chair before I was conscious of a thick, musky odor, subtle and nauseous. At the very first whiff of it, my brain and my imagination were beyond all control. A thick black cloud swirled before my eyes, and my mind told me that in this cloud, unseen as yet, was about to spring upon my appalled senses, lurking all that was vaguely horrible, all that was monstrous, inconceivably wicked in the universe. Such immense and warning of something coming, the evidence of some unspeakable dweller upon the threshold, whose very shadow would blast my soul. A freezing horror took possession of me. I felt that my hair was rising, that my eyes were protruding, and that my mouth was opened, and my tongue like leather. The turmoil within my brain was such that something was surely snap. I tried to scream, and was only vaguely aware of some hoarse croak, which was my own voice, and distant and detached from myself. At the same moment, in an effort to escape, I broke through that cloud of despair, and had a glimpse of Holmes's face, white, rigid, and drawn with horror, the very look which I had seen upon the features of the dead. It was a vision which gave me an instant of sanity and strength. I dashed from my chair, threw my arms around Holmes, and together we lurched through the door, and had an instant afterwards been thrown ourselves upon the grass plot, and were lying side by side, conscious only of the glorious sunshine which was bursting its way through the hellish cloud of terror which had girt us in. Slowly it rose from our souls like the mists of the landscape, until a peace and reason had returned, and we were sitting upon the grass, wiping our clammy foreheads, and looking with apprehension at each other to the last traces of the terrific experience which we had gone and had gone. "Upon my word, Watson," said Holmes at last, with an unsteady voice, "I owe you both my thanks and an apology. It was an unjustifiable experiment, even for oneself, and undoubtedly so for a friend. I'm really very sorry." "You know," I answered, with some emotion, for I had never seen so much of Holmes's heart before, "that it is my greatest joy and privilege to help you." He relapsed at once into the half-humorous, half-cynical vein which was his habitual attitude to those about him.
"It would be superfluous to drive us mad, my dear Watson," he said. "A candid observer would certainly declare that we were so already before embarked on so wild an experiment. I confess that I never imagined the effect would have been so sudden or so severe."
He dashed into the cottage, and reappearing with a burning lamp, held it at a full arm's length. He threw it upon the bank and brambles.
"We must give the room a little time to clear. I take it, Watson, that you no longer have a shadow of a doubt as to how these tragedies were produced."
"None whatsoever."
"But the cause remains as obscure as ever. Come into the arbor here, and let us discuss it further. That villainous stuff seems to linger down my throat. I think we must admit that all the evidence points to this man, Mortimer Tregennis, having been the criminal in the first tragedy, though he was a victim of the second one. We must remember, in the first place, that there is some story of a family quarrel, followed by a reconciliation. How bitter that quarrel may have been, and how hollow the reconciliation, we cannot say. When I think that Mortimer Tregennis, with the foxy face and small, shrewd, beady eyes behind the spectacles, he is not a man whom I would judge to be of particularly forgiving disposition. Well, in the next place, you'll remember that this idea of someone moving in the garden, which took our attention for a moment from the real tragedy of the case, emanated from him. He had a motive in misleading us. Finally, if he did not throw those substances into the fire at the moment of leaving the room, who did so? The affair happened immediately after his departure. Had anyone else come in, and the family would have certainly risen from the table. Besides, in peaceful Cornwall, the visitors do not arrive after 10 o'clock. We may take it, then, all the evidence points to Mortimer Tregennis as the culprit.
Then his own death was suicide.
Well, Watson, it is on the face of it not an impossible proposition. The man who had the guilt upon his soul of having brought such a fate upon his own family might well be driven to remorse and inflict it upon himself. There are, however, some cognate reasons against it. Fortunately, there is one man in England who knows all about it, and I have made arrangements by which we shall hear the facts this afternoon from his own lips. He is a little before his time. Perhaps you would kindly step this way, Dr. Leon Sterndale. We have been conducting a chemical experiment indoors, which has left us a little hardly fit for reception and a distinguished visitor.
I heard the click of the garden gate, and now the majestic figure of the great African explorer appeared upon the path. He turned in some surprise towards the rustic arbor in which we sat.
You sent for me, Mr. Holmes. I had your note about an hour ago, and I've come, though I really do not know why I should obey your summons.
Perhaps we can clear the point up before we separate, said Holmes. Meanwhile, I'm much obliged to you for your courteous questions. You'll excuse us this informal reception in the open air, but my friend Watson and I have furnished an additional chapter to what the papers call the Cornish horror, and we prefer to clear the atmosphere at the present. Perhaps, since the matters which we have to discuss will affect you personally, it is a very intimate fashion. It is as well as we should talk where we can have no eavesdropping. The explorer took a cigar from his lips and gazed sternly at my companion.
I'm at a loss to know, sir, he said, what you have to speak about which affects me personally in a very intimate fashion.
The killing of Mortimer Tregennis, said Holmes. For an instant I wished that I were armed. Sterndale's fierce face turned to a dusky red, his eyes glared, and the knotted, passionate veins started from his forehead, while he sprang forward with clenched hands towards my companion. Then he stopped, and with a violent effort he resumed the cold, rigid calmness which was, perhaps, more suggestive of danger than his hot-headed outburst.
I live so long among savages and beyond the law, said he, that I've got into the way of being a law myself. You would do well, Mr. Holmes, not to forget it, for I have no desire to do you an injury.
Nor have I any desire to do you an injury, Dr. Sterndale. Surely the clearest proof of that is, knowing what I know, I have sent for you and not for the police. Sterndale sat down with a gasp, overawed for perhaps the first time in his adventurous life. There was a calm assurance powers in Holmes's manner which could not be withstood. Our visitor stammered for a moment, his great hands opening and shutting with agitation.
What do you mean? He asked, at last. Is this a bluff upon your part, Mr. Holmes? You have chosen a bad man for your experiment. Let us have no more beating around the bush. What do you mean?
I will tell you, said Holmes, and the reason I will tell you is that I hope frankness may beget frankness. What my next step will be will depend entirely upon the nature of your own defense.
My defense?
Yes, sir.
My defense against what?
Against the charge of killing Mortimer Tregennis.
Sterndale mopped his forehead with his handkerchief.
Upon my word, what are you getting on? Said he. Do all your success depend upon the prodigious power of bluff?
The bluff, said Holmes sternly, is upon your side, Dr. Leon Strange, and not upon mine. As a proof, I will tell you some of the facts upon which my conclusions are based. Of your return to Plymouth, allowing much of your property to go to Africa, I will say nothing save that it first informed me that you were one of the factors which had to be taken into the reconstruction of this drama.
I came back.
I've heard your reasons in regard of them unconvincing and inadequate. We will pass that. You came down here to ask me whom I suspected. I refused to answer you. Then you went to the vicarage, waited outside for some time, and finally returned to your cottage.
How do you know that?
I followed you.
I saw no one.
That is what you may expect to see when I follow you. You spent a restless night at your cottage, and you formed certain plans, which in the early morning you proceeded to put out into execution. Leaving your door just as the day was breaking, you filled your pocket with some reddish gravel that was lying heaped beside your gate. Sterndale gave a violent start and looked at Holmes in amazement. And then you walked swiftly for a mile, which separated you from the vicarage. You were wearing, I may remark, the same pair of ribbed tennis shoes which you are presently momently on your feet. At the vicarage you passed through the orchard on the left side hedge, coming out under the window of the lodger Tregennis. It was now daylight, but the household was not yet stirring. You drew some gravel from your pocket and threw it up at the window above you. Sterndale sprang to his feet.
I believe you are the devil himself, he cried.
Holmes smiled at the compliment. It took 2 or possibly 3 handfuls before the lodger came to the window. You beckoned him to come down. He dressed hurriedly and descended to his sitting room. You entered by the window. There was an interview, a short one, during which you walked up and down the room. Then you passed out and closed the window, standing on the lawn outside smoking a cigar and watching what occurred. Finally, after the death of Tregennis, you withdrew as you had come. Now, Dr. Sterndale, how do you justify such conduct, and what were the motives of your actions? If you prevaricate or trifle with me, I will give you my assurance that the matter will pass out of my hands forever. Our visitor's face had turned ashen gray as he listened to the words of his accuser. Now he sat for some time in thought, and his face sunk into his hands. Then, with a sudden impulsive gesture, he plucked up the photograph from his breast pocket and threw it upon the rustic table before us.
This is why I've done what he said.
He showed the bust and face of a very beautiful woman. Holmes stooped over it. Brenda Tregennis, he said.
Yes, Brenda Tregennis,
Repeated our visitor.
For years I've loved her. For years she's loved me. There's a secret at Cornish seclusion which people have marveled at. It has brought me close to one thing on earth that was dear to me. I could not marry her, for I have a wife who has left me for years, and yet whom, for the deplorable laws of England, I could not divorce. For years Brenda waited. For years I waited. And this is what we've waited for. A terrible sob broke from his great frame, and he clutched his throat under the bridled beard. Then, with an effort, he mastered himself and spoke again. The vicar knew. He was in our confidence. He would tell you that she was an angel upon earth. That is why he telegraphed me and I returned. What was my baggage for West Africa to me when I learned that such a fate had become my darling? Here you have the missing clue to my action, Mr. Holmes.
Proceed, said my friend. Dr. Sterndale drew from his pocket a paper packet and laid it upon the table. On the outside was written, Ridus Pedis Diaboli, with a red poison label underneath it. He pushed it towards me.
I understand you're a doctor, sir. Have you ever heard of this preparation?
Devil's foot root. No, I have never heard of it.
It is no reflection upon your professional knowledge, said he, for I believe that, save for one sample in a laboratory in Buda, there is no other specimen in Europe. It has not yet found its way either into pharmacopoeia or into the literature of toxicology. The root is shaped like a foot, half human, half goat-like, and it's a fanciful name given by the botanical missionary.
It was used in the ordeal poison by the medicine men in certain districts of West Africa, and is kept a great secret among them. This particular specimen I obtained under very extraordinary circumstances in the Bagandi country. He opened the paper as he spoke, and then closed a heap of reddish-brown snuff-like powder. Well, sir, asked Mr. Holmes, I'm about to tell you, Mr. Holmes, all that actually occurred, for you already know that so much about it so clearly that my interest is that you should know it all. I've already explained the relationship in which I stood with the Draganis family. For the sake of my sister, I was ready with Brenda's. There was a family quarrel about money which estranged this man Mortimer, but it was supposed to be made up, and afterwards met him as did several others. He was a sly, subtle, scheming man, and had several things arose which gave me a suspicion of him, and I had no cause for any positive quarrel. One day, only a couple of weeks ago, he came down to my cottage, and I showed him some of my African curiosities. Among other things, I exhibited this powder, and I told him of its strange properties, how it simulates those brain centers which control the emotion of fear, and how either madness or death is the fate of an unhappy native who is subjected to the ordeal of the priests of his tribe. I told him how the powerless European science was to detect it, and how he took it I cannot say, for I never left the room. But there is no doubt that this is with him. While I was opening cabinets and stooping the boxes, that he managed to abstract some of the devil's root powder. I well remember how he plied me with his questions about it, the moments and the amount of time that was needed for the effect, but I little dreamed that he could have given a personal reason for asking. I thought no more about the matter until the vicar's telegram reached me at Plymouth. This villain had thought that I would be at sea before the news would reach me, and that I could see lost for the Africa in years. But I returned at once. Of course, I could not listen to the details without feeling assured that my poison had been used. I came around to see you on the chance that some other explanation had been suggested itself to you. But there could be none. I was convinced that Mortimer Treganis was a murderer, that for the sake of money, and with the idea that perhaps that if some other family members of his family were insane, he could be the sole guardian of the joint property. He had used the devil's foot powder upon them, driven two of them out of their senses, and killed his sister Brenda, the one human being whom I have ever loved, and who has ever loved me. There was his crime. What was to be his punishment? Should I appeal to the law? Where were my proofs? I knew that the facts were true, but I could hope to make an jury of countrymen believe so fantastic a story. I might or might not, but I could afford to fail. My soul cried out for revenge, and as I've said to you before, Mr. Holmes, that I have spent much of my life outside the law, and that I have come at last to be the law myself. So it was now. I determined that the fate of which had been given to the others should be shared by himself. Either that, or I would do justice upon him with my own hand. In all England there can be no man who sets less value upon his own life than I do at the present moment. Now I have told you all. You have yourself supplied with the rest. I did, as you say, after a restless night, set off early at my cottage, and foresaw the difficulty of arousing him. So I gathered some gravel from the pile which you have mentioned, and I used to throw it up to the window. He came down and admitted to me through the window of the sitting room. I laid no offense before him. I told him that I had come back out as judge and executioner. The wretch sank down into a chair paralyzed at the sight of my revolver. I lit the lamp, put the powder above it, and stood outside the window, ready to carry out my threat to shoot him should he try to leave the room. In 5 minutes he died. My God, how he died! But my heart was flint, for he endured nothing which my innocent darling had not felt before him. There is my story, Mr. Holmes. Perhaps if you loved a woman, you would have done as much yourself. At any rate, I am in your hands. You can take what steps you like. As I've already said, there's no man living who can fear death less than I do. Holmes sat for a little time in silence. What were your plans? He asked at last. I intended to bury myself in Central Africa. My work there is but half finished. Go and do the other half, said Holmes. I, at least, am not prepared to prevent you.
Dr. Sterndale raised his giant figure, bowed gravely, and walked from the harbor. Holmes lit his pipe and handed me his pouch.
Some fumes which are not poisonous would be welcome change, said he. I think you must agree, Watson, that it is not a case in which we are called upon to interfere. Our investigation has been independent, and our actions shall be so also. You would not denounce the man?
Certainly not, said I.
I have never loved Watson, but if I did, if the woman I loved had not met such an end, I might act even as a lawless lion hunter has done. Who knows? Well, Watson, I will not offend your intelligence by explaining what is obvious. The gravel upon the windowsill was, of course, the starting point of my research. It was unlike anything in the vicarage garden. Only when my attention had been drawn to Dr. Sterndale and his cottage did I find its counterpart. The lamp shining in broad daylight and the remains of powder upon the shield were successive links in the fairly obvious chain. And now, my dear Watson, I think we may dismiss this matter from our mind, and go back with a clear conscience to the study in the Chelan roots, which are surely to be traced in the Cornish branch of the great Celtic speech. Yay! That leaves one story, which I will get to next week. And what was the trivia about Alice Cooper was in Marvel Comics? What? Oh, okay. Cool. Yeah, I can totally see Alice Cooper in a Marvel comic. I mean, why not? Everyone else has.
And there, my dear chat, we shall leave it for the evening. But let us now see if there is anyone with which we can raid. I see that the lovely Sophia is also streaming right now, and it is so very rarely that I ever get to raid another reader. Let me see what she is up to. She is reading Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift. Let us see if we shall drop in on her. You all, of course, know Gulliver's Travels. If not, you will learn. Oh, I did not type that properly.
Just to prevent a raid from happening. Okay. Let's read Sophia. Okay. Again, thank you all for coming in. And, yeah, let's go see Sophia. Yeah. I hope you all have a great night. And then again, thank you for coming, man. And thank you for the raid, Oni. And I will see you all tomorrow for Fairy Tales. Night.